Jessica Ernst is exposing a system, the same sort of system that the Catholic Church used to cover up the tracks of pedophile priests in Boston. And the Boston Globe did a very good investigative series around 2001, 2002 on how the system worked. And it worked the same way, and how the bishop covered up for these pedophile priests. Fracking abuses have worked. You find a law firm. The law firm goes to the abused parties, gives them some money. They sign a settlement. There is no record of what then took place. And, the church is allowed to go on and send this abusive priest to another parish, and the cycle of abuse goes on.
Hi there, how are you?
Good, nice to meet you.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. It's pretty exciting for me to stand up in front of you. I have lived in Rosebud for 20 years, and I have been hearing about fracking and its effects for at least 10. I'm excited that for the first time we're gathered as a community to talk about this issue, thanks to the work of respected journalist and our guest tonight, Mr. Andrew Nikiforuk. For some time, I have felt that as our friends and neighbors have experienced the consequences of fracking, we, their community, and I include myself, have largely been silent, quite possibly unsure of the truth and fearful of taking sides. One of the reasons Andrew wrote this book is because of a brave Rosebud resident who I'm pleased to say is in our crowd. And I'd like to take this opportunity to personally thank you, Jessica Ernst, for all you've done and all you're doing to expose the dangers of fracking in order to protect your water and our water. And now, Andrew Nikiforuk has been writing about the oil and gas industry for more than 20 years, and the Ernst case since 2004. He won the Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award for tar sands, Canada's Governor General Award for saboteurs, and 7 National Magazine Awards, as well as the 2013 Writers' Trust Award in celebration of a writing life. He was one of the first journalists in North America to document the devastating effects of hydraulic fracturing on communities. He lives in Calgary, Alberta at present, and I'm most pleased that he agreed to begin his book tour here in Rosebud. Please welcome Andrew Nikiforuk.
Thank you so much, Shauna. I can't tell you what a pleasure and an honor it is to launch this book in this community, in Rosebud, which I first came to in 2004. And it was a revelation. At that time I thought, wow, what a beautiful place here in the coulees. And I knew nothing about it. And I had been invited by several people to come and talk to a particular individual by the name of Jessica Ernst. And she was at that time concerned about the beginnings of really what was an incredible industrial revolution. And that was the fracking of coal seams in the Horseshoe Basin. At the time, I knew very little about fracking. I knew very little about the impact of the technology even on coals. Knew even less about Jessica Ernst other than the fact that she worked for the oil and gas industry. And I thought it was, to me, it was unusual to have somebody working directly in the industry who was upset about industrial practices, but more importantly, she was really upset not so much with her industry at the time as she was with the regulator and the way the regulator was responding to the concerns of rural citizens who were experiencing this phenomenal level of development. So it's great to be able to come here tonight and to tell you some of the stories behind the story. And I'm not going to be able to answer all of your questions that you might have about what happened directly in this community, but I think I can fill you in on some of the science, and I can fill you in on some of the other stories that rural citizens in North America have shared with me about their experience living in communities that have been heavily fracked. And then I'd also like to acknowledge Diana Donheimer and Kimberly, who are bookends. They are at the end of this book. I call them the Sisters of Jessica Ernst. And they are Albertans to the core, and they have taken courageous stands in their community to point out to authorities some of the issues that has been created by this technology. Two very courageous women, and I'm very happy to see them here tonight. Very honored to have them here tonight. And their stories are remarkable. Okay, so I think what we're going to do is I'm going to tell some of these stories. Then I'm going to invite Jessica Ernst to come and talk about what it's like to be part of a major lawsuit that has dragged on for 8 years. And then we'll open for questions. I think the first part of this story that's really important, I've been writing about the oil and gas industry now for almost more than 25 years. I think the other thing that makes me a bit different than a lot of other journalists is that I actually own land in this province. And so I know what it means to be a landowner, and I've been a member at various times, particularly of the Livingston Landowners Group, and I've also been very much involved with the Pekisco Landowners Group, and which is a group of ranchers in the foothills. And Livingston is a group of ranchers and farmers in the south end of the Porcupine Hills. So I come to a lot of these issues with that very distinct perspective, as not just as a reporter, but somebody who also owns land and understands the responsibilities of land ownership and some of the trouble that land ownership can bring down upon you when you are trying to defend the integrity of your land. All right, so I think the first story that's important, this is a story we're all a part of, is that the energy business has changed, and it's changed dramatically. 100 years ago, it was all about cheap energy, and cheap energy was at the top of the pyramid, and you wouldn't have to drill very deep to find it, and there would be enormous pools, and we had this flood of cheap energy on the North American continent for 100 years that made North America what it is. But now we're moving down the triangle, and what happened here in beginning in 2002, 2003, 2004 was the beginning of a dramatic change in the industry itself as it started to tackle more difficult and more extreme hydrocarbons that came with greater expenses, greater expenditures of water, greater greenhouse gas emissions, greater impact on people living near these facilities. So when you look, shale gas and oil shale and coal bed methane, these are at the bottom. And what industry will tell you is that, there's a lot of this stuff in the ground, but it's of extremely low quality. It is easy to find. Everyone knows where the coal basins are in this province. They were mapped years ago, but it is difficult to develop, high cost, and the margins are very low. And in fact, the CBM industry basically died in this province in 2012 after gas prices tanked. Natural gas prices we're talking about. So that's one story we need to keep in the back of our minds. That's very much part of the story of the book in Slick Water. The other story that is played out here is a story about existing long-standing liabilities on the landscape. Every time you drill a well into the ground, you are creating a pathway. And over time, through that pathway, methane and other gases, including radon, sometimes CO2, sometimes hydrogen sulfide, will leak if they can find a path to the surface. And most wells leak as they age because the cement is like bubble gum underneath a desk or underneath a chair. As it gets older and older, that bubble gum begins to crack and crumble, and these leaks become more pronounced over time. So we have nearly 5 million wells, oil and gas wells, on the landscape in North America that have been drilled over the last 100 years. Many of them were poorly plugged. Many of them leak to this day, and they are all considered by some pretty important scientists in the industry as liabilities in terms of chronic methane gas releases, either to the atmosphere or to groundwater. So not all the gas is coming up and going straight into the atmosphere. A lot of it is going into groundwater. So it's finding the path of least resistance, traveling along these other pathways, and getting into groundwater. Now this was all happening before fracking. The other thing that you need to remember too is that, all right, so we have all these wells on the landscape. This landscape is naturally fractured. The ground is, shales are full of fractures. Coal is one of the most fractured rocks on the planet. There are natural fracks and faults throughout the Earth's surface. And quite often the oil and gas industry will connect to those faults. And so here we have Maurice Dussault, probably one of the most important petroleum geologists in North America. He's at the University of Waterloo. Recently came out with a paper, said, look, we've got 500,000 wells in Canada, and they're a threat to our environment and public safety. Why? Because many of them have been badly cemented and they are leaking. So that's your existing liability on the landscape. And then you think, okay, so you've got all these wells, many of them are leaking, many have been leaking into groundwater, into the atmosphere, and then we begin seismic-like activities with the technology of hydraulic fracturing. What is hydraulic fracturing all about? It's about crushing rock underground, pulverizing it, and creating mini earthquakes. And these mini earthquakes then can destabilize and loosen the other existing infrastructure in the ground, other wells. So we've got the existing liability, then we add a new technology to this complicated picture where you've got wells and you've got leaking wells, and now we've got this new technology that's all about shaking the stuff up that's there. And the best way to think of hydraulic fracturing, and it really should be almost called fluid injection. You're taking enormous amounts of water, or you're taking enormous amounts of gas, combining it sometimes with other chemicals, some of them highly toxic, some of them kitchen sink stuff, and sand, and the sand is there to help prop open and keep open the fractures that are created by these highly pressurized streams and injections of water or gas. And now this technology has got quite a history, because that was one of the first things when I came here in 2004, and I wrote a story. I think it was called "Life Inside a Science Experiment" for the Globe and Mail at the time, and what I really understood about the time was I understood that there was a huge density of wells being planted around this community. The density kept on growing. I didn't really understand the fracking part. I knew that Jessica Ernst was incredibly concerned at that point about the noise from the compressor stations. And you could see this kind of collision where industry was moving very quickly and very rapidly and doing something in terms of high density drilling it hadn't done before, and the regulators doing a catch-up job but I didn't get what was really going on underground. So I thought, okay, how did all this fracking stuff start? And just before I get there, so here's a slide from the regulator in Alberta in a presentation that was given in Colorado just a couple of years ago, talking about the existing liabilities, all right, all these leaking wells on the landscape, and then you add this new technology to the picture, and with the result, as the regulator was putting it, the skeletons are coming out of the closet, all right? So if you've got a badly cemented well, somebody did a really poor plug job on your well, hell's bells, you're gonna have more methane coming out of that thing or going into groundwater. So fracking, where did it begin and what's it all about and how did it start? Well, it's got this most amazing history. It started in the 1860s in the United States, just directly after the Civil War. And this is Pennsylvania, which was at that time sort of the Alberta of North America. I mean, this is where the whole oil business and oil rush, first genuine oil rush on the continent started. This was bigger than the gold rush in San Francisco in terms of people coming to Pennsylvania with oil on the brain, as the New York Times put it, to make their fortunes. And look how closely spaced those wells are. All right, enormously shallow wells too. But the problem was that after you'd have a well, it might be, produce 60 barrels of oil for a couple of months, and then it'd be down to 5 barrels or 1 barrel, and it was plugging up with wax, plugging up with rocks. And so what was the solution? How do you make these wells last a little bit longer? Well, a Union colonel who had survived the Battle of Fredericksburg, where the Confederates just mowed down Union troops, came up with the torpedo as an answer. All right, so he had this dead weight. He had a torpedo filled with black powder, and you'd send the dead weight down. It'd ignite this bomb in the well shaft and create fractures, new fractures in the rock. And that's what its purpose was. So, and quite often, this would destroy the well, but more often than not, it would open more fractures and more oil would come into the well, and you would increase your production for another couple of months. And so the torpedo business took off in Pennsylvania like you wouldn't believe. Colonel Roberts, who came up with this torpedo, became an enormously wealthy man and sued anybody who tried to come up with something a little bit different than his device. And then, of course, they graduated to nitroglycerin. As a result, throughout Pennsylvania, they would be collecting torpedo men when jobs went bad in cigar boxes, what was left of them. And the newspapers would be writing about this all the time. And almost every week there'd be some story about this. Now, so the competitors and other companies that were forming and creating their own bombs to go off and frack these shallow wells, they were known as moonlighters. And because Colonel Roberts had everything tied up and sued anybody that tried to frack without his patented torpedo. In fact, I think he had a record for the most lawsuits of any person in the United States. He was the most litigious man possible and probably started the whole legacy of being highly litigious in the oil and gas industry, I think. And so these guys would go out on their own, do their own jobs with their own nitro, and they were known as moonlighters because, of course, you could see them, the jobs at night, these huge explosions, the white light going off, crack and boom, and then collecting the body parts in the morning if something went wrong, as it often did. So that's how fracking started, and then it slowly evolved. And by the 1930s, industry was thinking, this nitro business is kind of hazardous, but there were nitro frac jobs throughout southern Alberta, Montana. Charlie Stallmaker, who is probably one of the most famous nitro frackers, he had a little red truck and said, warning, nitro on the back, and you never have to worry about being tailgated. And but the industry started to move off, and they experimented with chemicals, and they experimented with water, and they learned that even a cement job, which is a form of fluid injection, could crack and rock, and that their cement jobs would go off in different directions, which gave them the idea that, well, maybe we should try highly pressured amounts of water and see what happens that way, and they did. So here then you see, an example of what a frac job started to look like in the 1950s, where you have a small amount of horsepower on site. You might be taking 10,000 gallons of water. Quite often it was napalm or diesel fuel or something like that they would use, and then a little bit of sand, and usually be river sand, to help open up these formations and extend the life of a well. And but then by the 1960s, the technology started to go off in some pretty wild and crazy directions, and they said, okay, well, why don't we try some nuclear fracs? And sure enough, they did in the United States, in New Mexico and Colorado, as part of Project Plowshares, the goal of which was to use nuclear energy for so-called safe purposes, and peaceful purposes. And so they tried this. They had some 3,000 to 4,000 deep shale deposits that they really had no way of accessing. They thought, let's drop a nuclear bomb in there, 22 kiloton, and see what happens. And what they did is they created a glass dome and some very highly radioactive natural gas for which there was no market. So that was a bit of a dead end at the time. And then the industry evolved, and by the late 1990s, finally arrived at a highly efficient form of fracking involving slick water. All right, and in this case, we're talking about huge volumes of water lubricated with oil products, petroleum distillates, diesel fuel, and that would be so the water would travel faster and easier through the wellbore and at greater speeds down to your target formation that you wanted to crack open to release some hydrocarbons. So there you've got these phenomenal operations, involving 5 million gallons of frac with tremendous horsepower being required to inject this stuff into the ground. So when industry talks about fracking being around for 60 years, it's been around for nearly 120 years. What was around for the last 60 years was really a canoe in technological terms. I mean, not a lot of water, very little horsepower, not a lot of sand. In most cases, they were all vertical fracs, all going straight down. There were no horizontal drilling whatsoever involved in these fracking operations. But then we go from this canoe in the 1950s to the 1990s. We're basically operating a nuclear submarine in terms of the power, the force. And industry executives, we're quite open about this. If you talk to people at Schlumberger, talk to people at Halliburton, they'll say this is a brute force technology. And what has happened here, what we see in the evolution of the technology is basically about, okay, if you can't crack this rock, apply more force. And that's what it's all been about. Now, a number of American scientists began to notice a few things about this approach to using a lot of force. So in the 1960s, there was a chemical weapons base outside of Denver run by the US military. They wanted to get rid of all these biological warfare and chemical warfare stuff that they had made and was stockpiled and leaking at the base. And they said, okay, the solution is we'll inject it into the ground, a mile or 2 miles into the ground, and we'll get rid of it, and that'll be the end of the story. What they found, though, is that they were injecting such large amounts of contaminated fluid at such high pressures that they began to cause a series of earthquakes, one of which caused severe structural damage in a suburb of Denver, Colorado. And so that was the first inkling that engineers and scientists had that fluid injection over long periods of time with enormous amounts of fluid will hit faults and fractures in the ground and will cause earthquakes. And then the American researchers experimenting with what was called mega fracking in the 1980s in Oklahoma discovered the same thing. They discovered that with even short bursts of fluid injection, which is what a hydraulic fracture is, you could trigger earthquakes. And they were getting, as early as 1978, 3,000 meter deep well in Oklahoma, and they would be triggering 70 micro earthquakes, magnitude 1, magnitude 2 area. But that's significant because you're telling you something about how much brute force you're using in this process. And of course, we've evolved. The amount of fluid injection associated with hydraulic fracturing in Oklahoma now, where all the wastewater that is being produced from wells is then being reinjected into the ground at such an enormous pressures and in enormous volumes that Oklahoma is now the most seismically active state in the United States, more active than California. And that's from fluid injection, wastewater disposal wells. In British Columbia, the industry almost exclusively through hydraulic fracturing, so some of the largest frac jobs have all taken place in northern BC or in Fox Creek in northern Alberta, where the volumes of water is 3 times what is used in a normal frac job in the United States. So enormous pressures, high volume, and you're triggering significant earthquake activity as high as 4.6. Nobody ever thought the technology could trigger an earthquake that big. Scientists don't even know what the limit is. The problem here is that there's one of public safety. I mean, not a lot of buildings in Alberta are directly made to endure earthquakes of a magnitude, let's say 5. That's not what the code is, because Alberta, for the most part, is a seismically quiet place. And there's another issue with all this seismic activity. So if you think of hydraulic fracturing as making all of these man-made earthquakes in the ground while you're pulverizing all this rock, you're creating faults and fractures. And these faults and fractures can lead to other pathways and connect to other existing well bores on the landscape. And the thing we know about earthquakes is they mobilize the gases in the ground. So one of the best predictor of an earthquake in Japan, let's say, will be the level of radon above the ground. Just, when you start having the microquakes, the gases are released, and that is one of the best indicators now for knowing when an earthquake is going to hit, because the level of radon and methane and CO2 will rise where there are natural fractures in the earth. All right. And the last thing about the technology, again, that as I explored it, was learning more about it, was, okay, so there's this claim that, it's never contaminated groundwater. Well, that's a load of nonsense. One of the things that I found is going through industry's patents, and there are hundreds and hundreds of patents for various different kinds of fracking. So the patents all say 2 things. Number one, they call fracking not a science, they call it an art. Right? Then the second thing they talk about is that their constant problem is the fracs do not stay in the target zone, and they go out of zone, and quite often they will go into groundwater or into water sources, or they will go into other existing oil and gas wells. So they will travel. And so here, 1987, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency documents the case, and it's worthwhile I'll quickly read it. During the fracturing process, fractures can be produced, allowing migration of native brine, fracturing fluid, and hydrocarbons from the oil or gas well to a nearby water well. When this happens, the water well can be permanently damaged and a new well must be drilled or an alternative source of drinking water found. Now, if you guys remember, back to Rosebud and the CBM drilling controversy in this province in 2006 and 2007, no regulator, no politician in this province said, hey, wait a moment, this kind of stuff can happen. And it's part and process of what goes wrong with this technology, because it's an art form, it's not a science. And you can't always predict where your fracks are going to go. And then this led me, of course, okay, well, what about fracking and coal? I mean, you can frack shales. We know that shales, for the most part, are deep, and so there's no water supplies that are going to be directly affected by the fracking of very deep shales, except, of course, that the problem there is that the gas that leaks from these wells is not coming from the target source in most cases. In 70% of the cases, the gas is coming somewhere in the middle of the well. And so that's where the gas is coming from, and then it travels up the well bore and finds its way to the surface. So the idea that by drilling deeper, you are somehow protecting groundwater sources is not correct, because the leaking gases are coming from the middle of the pathway. All right, so the Americans kind of led this whole revolution, right? As they, in the 1980s, were running out of cheap oil and cheap gas, and they were desperate for, other sources. So we've got lots of coal. Let's try fracking the coal. We don't know what is going to happen, but let's try it. We've got lots of it. I mean, 13% of the United States has got coal underneath it. So they went to the San Juan Basin and Colorado and New Mexico, and they went to the Black Warrior Basin in Alabama. And I thought, okay, to understand what happened here, I should go back to these folks and say, okay, what was your experience with fracking coals in your neck of the woods? And that also got me a bit into the history of coal mining, which is, I mean, if you ever want to read a bunch of horror stories, start reading about early 18th century, 19th century coal mining, because one of the big problems was gas migration, or what the miners would call fire damp, right? So when you are clawing your way through a coal seam, you're fracking the hell out of it, basically, whether it's with picks or shovels or whatever. And at the same time, because coal is both a reservoir and a source of methane, you are releasing that methane. You're also coming to pockets, you're coming to natural fractures where methane is accumulated. So sometimes you would hit so much methane in some of these mines that you'd be blowing miners right out the mouth of the hole, and hundreds of yards. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of miners dying in this industry as a result of the accumulation of methane in the mines from primitive fracking. And the primitive fracking is just the hacking away with drills and so on in these early coal mines. And I mean, that coal mine to me looks like almost like a horizontal slick water operation. And so what happened when they fracked the coals in the San Juan Basin? Well, I talked to a fellow by the name, and which looks a lot like the country around Drumheller. And so I talked to a number of people. I talked to Laura Lyon, who ran a small little ranch there, and a fellow by the name of Carl Weston, who had worked for the government and retired and lived near the Los Animas River. And after a couple of years of fracking in the 1980s, they had gas coming up everywhere. They had it coming up in the rivers, they had it coming up in people's homes, they had it coming up in people's water wells. There was a class action suit against Amoco, which I talk about in the book, which ended up going nowhere. Amoco had a much better bunch of lawyers, no doubt about it. And it all got tied up in a jurisdictional dispute about is this in the right court or the wrong court, because all of the leaking of the methane was taking place on Indian lands. In the end, the landowners decided to settle, which they did. They They then signed confidentiality agreements, and so there's no record of what happened at this time. And Carl Weston, he got methane in his water. He became famous for being able to light his lemonade on fire. And so what I came to realize was, okay, the stories here in Rosebud and in other parts of the province, weren't unusual. And that once you start cracking coal, you're going to release methane one way or another. And that methane's going to find the path of least resistance to the surface. And the problem today is that so much has been fracked in the San Juan Basin that there is a cloud of methane over this whole area of the Four Corners states that is basically the size of Connecticut. And scientists call it the largest methane anomaly in North America. And methane, of course, is one of the worst greenhouse gases you can think of. So that big red dot, that's methane coming out of coal seams that have been dewatered and fracked in the San Juan Basin. And a lot of that methane is also coming from leaking facilities, from compressors and pipelines, well sites, abandoned wells that weren't plugged properly, as well as coming directly out of coal seams that have been fracked. Now Schlumberger, said, okay, I admitted a couple years later, because of the shallow depth of many CBM basins, and they're all shallow, the potential exists for a fracture growing out of zone and affecting freshwater aquifers. Again, you would not hear that from a regulator in this province, but you would hear it from the engineers designing the technology at Schlumberger, because they knew. Because they knew what happened in San Juan. They also knew what happened in the Black Warrior Basin in Alabama, too. All right, now this brings us to Jessica Ernst. And one of there are many interesting things I could say about Jessica Ernst. I've known her for since 2004. And I must say, I now consider her to be a friend, a good friend. But one of the things that always struck me was that, okay, well, this gal has been working in the industry for a long time, more than 25 years. And she's worked for some of the biggest oil and gas companies on the continent, whether it be Esso, whether it be Chevron, whether it be the Great Canadian Oil Sands Company, whether it be Encana. And she's also worked for companies with really awful names like Predator. The point being is that as an environmental consultant, she was out in the field. She was assessing pipelines. She was assessing cumulative impacts. She was doing work with some enormously powerful companies. She was invited into the boardrooms where she was known to be quite opinionated and not afraid to tell certain people off when she thought they were trying to get away with doing something that was not right or cutting corners. And so she had established quite a reputation in the industry, and she knew it inside out. She knew how it worked. She knew how it thought. And she enjoyed the work she was doing. So when this trouble started in Rosebud, she found that she was reluctantly drawn into it. People were asking her questions. Jess, you work for the industry. Can you tell me what the hell's going on here? Why are they drilling all these wells here? What are they doing here? Can you find out for it? What is this land agreement they want us to sign? And so, and Jess was here. She chose this community because it is a peaceful place and a quiet place, and she was hoping to enjoy that peace and quiet here. God had other plans for her, Bo. There's that famous joke, which I better remember it first before I try to tell it. Yeah, how do you make God laugh? Well, just tell him your plans. So Jess found herself being dragged into this whole issue, not out of her choice at all. She felt, okay, well, the community is asking some questions. I will try to answer these questions. And then one thing led to another. And the most uncomfortable part of it was that one of her biggest and largest clients was Encana. And Encana was the biggest and most aggressive driller here in the Horseshoe Canyon. And from the start, everyone knew that the Horseshoe Canyon coals would be difficult, that they would require extensive drilling, high-density drilling, so a lot of wells close together, that they would require a fair amount of experimentation because they didn't quite know how to release the methane from the coals. So they would be using lots of different fluids and lots of different techniques. They eventually arrived at nitrogen fracs as the best way to release the methane in the coal seams here. And that you would also have to have all these compressor stations to collect and gather all this gas. And so it would just barely be an economic proposition from the very beginning. So high cost, high risk, that's what it was all about. Encana thought, okay, but if we hit enough sweet spots, we're going to make a lot of money. And so the initial projections were for nearly 50,000 wells for the Horseshoe Canyon between Calgary and Edmonton. So essentially about 20,000 eventually were drilled. But in the space of around between 2004 and 2010, you had nearly 10,000 wells drilled on the landscape, on a landscape that was already well punctured by other oil and gas wells, right? You've got a lot of other formations here that industry has tapped for a long time, particularly Pembina Formation and other stuff. So, boom, along comes this CBM. And you see this an enormous increase in the density of drilling. Well, all you have to do is look at any map that shows you where all the groundwater wells in the province and who are most dependent on groundwater, and it's that whole rural community between Edmonton and Calgary. And that's exactly where the Horseshoe Canyon Basin is located. And they said, well, don't worry, it's all dry coals. Yeah, and the majority of these coals are dry, but not all of them. There's, water always travels through coal. And that's what happened here, was when Encana fractured into an aquifer. Now, one of the many things that Jessica has done, there are a number of things that really stand out about her as a person. She's got this kind of rat trap memory, where she never forgets a goddamn thing. You sort of think, oh my, geez, how did you remember that? Did I say that? Yes, I did say that. She's impeccable when it comes to keeping records of stuff. Right? So she's an impeccable record keeper. She has this extraordinary memory. And then she also has this ability to see things at different levels. I don't know quite how to describe it, but it is quite extraordinary. I haven't met too many people like this in my lifetime who can sort of stand back and in this kind of very almost visionary way begin to say, okay, well, analyze it and take things apart and look at things from three different perspectives and levels. Almost like this 3D vision of stuff, right? So one of the first things she did was to check on was, well, how much shallow fracking is going on? And then she started to map it. And by the way, I always laugh. I think, a lot of environmentalists say, well, Jessica Ernst, she's that kind of, that green gal in Rosebud, when in fact, all of the information, all of the help she got came from professional engineers in the business who were upset about the pace and scale of what was going on in this community. So some of the province's actually top heavy oil geologists were all helping Jessica Ernst, saying, all right, I'm going to teach you how to do this kind of mapping, and I'm going to teach you where you can find all the data and put it together. And that's a remarkable story in itself, that I tell in the book. So she was talking to Chris Gerritsen who's a very well-known water well driller in this community. And Chris said, I think I've got a document that you might find of interest. And she came over to Chris's place and picked it up, and it was a report by HCL for Encana on contamination of several water wells in Redland, including the Kenny well, the Sean Kenny well. And so this is a very interesting illustration because it shows, this is the 0514 Encana well just up the hill here, which is now cemented in, and you can't see it or find it. But this well went right down, and it was frac'd at 24 different intervals. 70 million liters of frac fluid and nitrogen went into this well. And you can see the fracking began at the same stratigraphic level as the Kenny wells were located at. And what did Kenny find in his well? He found an enormous amount of nitrogen. Where did that nitrogen come from? It came from the Encana frac job. That's not what the report, though, said. The report didn't mention, totally omitted that nitrogen was part of the frac fluid. And then the report strangely added that, if you go to Kalmar, which is, nearly hundreds of miles away from here near Edmonton, there are wells up there with nitrogen in them, so therefore this nitrogen must be natural. But it wasn't. So that was the evidence that got Jessica Ernst really going. That and the fact that one day at dinner, a heavy oil geologist and his wife were visiting, and Jess had put some water on the table, and it was fizzing like she had dropped Alka-Seltzer in the water. And the heavy oil geologist, who had been to her place many times, said, "What the hell is going on with your water, Jess? Your water is beautiful, and it is great, it's excellent, but I can't tell if that's CO2 in your water or methane, or you've got to have that checked out. That is not right." It was fizzing like ginger ale onto the table. Her dogs wouldn't drink it. Fiona Lordson and her family were seeing similar things happening to their water. Debbie Signer and Debbie, I forgot to acknowledge you at the beginning, my apologies. Debbie Singer lived in this very community where this report was done, and she has done some incredibly courageous work there in terms of trying to bring attention to this issue. And she is dutifully acknowledged in the book. So this well then, what were they saying about it? Well, all this fluid, very shallow, 125 meters, and all that Encana produced from this well was water, 8,000 liters of water a day. So they had frac'd into the aquifer, essentially. And Encana plugged it. So what do the textbooks say about fracking? Well, here's a very popular textbook by Norman J. Hine from the United States. A well can be fracked several times during its lifetime, and in some instances, however, hydraulic fracturing can harm a well by fracking into water. The hydraulically induced fractures extend vertically into a water reservoir that floods the well with water. That's what happened here. And I look for other examples, all right? So has this happened other places in the United States or in other places in Canada? Yes, it has. In some cases, it's been very, very well documented. This is a report done in the journal Groundwater by petroleum geologist and groundwater expert Samuel Harrison, I think in 1983, 1984. And you can see what part of Pennsylvania he's talking about. And nearly the identical situation. Gas well, frac job, methane travels through natural fractures, and in one case, the pump well exploded. In another case, as with the Lordsons, you could set your water hose on fire. And depending on where the natural fractures were in the ground that the methane found the path of least resistances really determined whether or not your water well ended up with methane in it or not. Because I know when I've been in Rosebud and I've talked to people to say, well, my water is okay, so how is that possible? Well, a lot of things are possible underground that we really don't understand. And so Jessica, when she got hold of this information, having worked in the industry, she said, you know what, there's a problem here. And the law in Alberta says this, two things. Number one, you can't divert water without a permit. So you can't frack into an aquifer and produce that water unless you've applied to the government for a permit to do something. She looked, Encana never applied for that permit. The second thing is that you resolve any allegation of impact. And there was no attempt to do that. So she felt then that her client, and she had by this point resigned from Encana, had broken the law. And in fact, they have. A lot of people said, well, methane. You're going to have natural methane in water. It's as natural as can be. What's the problem here? Yes, you can go to oil and gas regions and you can find small amounts of methane in some groundwater and in some water wells, but you are not going to find it at these levels of 30 to 66 milligrams per liter. That's unheard of. Even up in Lethbridge, where they had a chronic problem of gas migration from heavy oil wells into groundwater and into water wells, we're talking about 0.5 milligram, or at the most 19 milligrams of methane. These are explosive levels of methane. And at the same time, there were other people in the province having similar issues. This is a pump house up around Grand Prairie at Bruce Jack's farm. And when this explosion took place, Bruce Jack had two technicians walking towards the door of the pump house to check out all of the methane that was coming out of his water after two nearby energy wells had been fracked. And the explosion nearly damn well killed Bruce Jack. There's no public record of this event in the province. There was a report written for Alberta Innovates, but you would have to go through Freedom of Information to get it. And Jessica Ernst knew about this because Bruce Jack gave her a call. She was getting calls now all the time from farmers and ranchers living in the CBM territory and outside with questions about their well water. And we're talking now about scores and scores of people raising this issue throughout the province. I just thought of the Campbells here, who also, I must apologize to Sean and Rona Lee. They're ranchers from Ponoka. And they are one of the folks that started, Sean phoned Jessica one day and said, I think you met her at a meeting. And said, I've got the same problem you have. And they fought for years and years to get the truth. And they were not allergic to oil and gas development. They had experienced oodles of it over their lifetime. Their ranch had lots of wellheads on it. But what changed was the scale of brute force being used on these wells, with the result that they had contaminated water and H2S in their water. And the story goes on. The Bruce Jack investigation that was done finally, I got a copy of it just 2 weeks ago. And so here's their conclusion. They identified 2 gas wells with surface casing vent flows were 2 leaks and uncemented zones. Results of a gas migration study confirmed that gas was leaking from these energy wells. Gas in Mr. Jack's water well included a component of deeper thermogenic gas. In other words, it was coming from an industrial source. Now, there are so many aspects of of the case as Jessica started to raise more and more questions, both to industry and regulators. And all she wanted the truth, she wanted the facts on the table, she wanted accountable people to be accountable. That's all she wanted. And nobody wanted to do that because of these greater liabilities that existed in the province. And one of the most amazing things and Jessica actually found this out. She applied through, I get freedom of information for a whole bunch of stuff, and she was, curious why, after the cursory Alberta investigation, the conclusion was methane is all natural, and everybody in this community who's got a problem is not maintaining their water wells properly, right? So they just wrote the whole thing off. And she said, well, what the hell, how could you actually do that? So she applies for freedom of information. She finds this memorandum from the Alberta Research Council, and it's dated 2007, a year before Alberta came out with its report saying there's no problem. And here is John McDougall, who's the head of the Alberta Research Council at that time, saying, Alberta Environment will be responding to affected landowners where contamination appears to be related to poor water well maintenance or naturally occurring methane-producing bacteria rather than from coal bed methane activities. Landowners may not willingly accept the findings determined by Alberta Environment and Alberta Research Council. He's saying a year before the study came out, they had already determined the conclusion. That's fraud. So, Encana frac'd into the aquifers. I don't think they meant to do it, but that's what they did do. Alberta Environment conducted a bogus investigation, and Alberta Research Council covered it up and omitted all of the most important data. And then the story goes on, of course. At this point, we've done all this fracking in central Alberta. You've got the shale gas revolution exploding across North America, and one community after another is kind of lighting up in response to the heavy industrialization of rural areas, the heavy use of water, the ozone pollution, the fragmentation of farmland. And industry is trying to, don't worry, it's just your friendly Fracosaurus coming through your neighborhood. This was an actual cartoon coloring book that was handed out in Pennsylvania by Talisman Resources. And you had the regulator then making presentations like this again in places like Colorado, not in Alberta. Well, we've got a problem. Increasing number of horizontal, multi-stage, hydraulic fractured wells, large numbers of pre-existing well bores, potential to impact assets and groundwater. And assets, what are they talking about? The potential to frack into other oil and gas wells, which they've done a lot of in this province. I mean, again, we're talking about close to 100 wells that have been fracked into from other operations. It's called inter-well communication. And here's some of the pre-existing problems, where you, again, a serious gas migration problem coming from a wellhead somewhere that's not coming straight up at the wellhead. It's traveling a long distance. Some of these fractures carrying gas can travel kilometers and then come up in the most unlikely places. Again, following the path of least resistance. The number of leaking wells in the province, the province estimates it's around 5% of all of the existing wells. Is probably much bigger than that because they don't test each wells at the end of their lifetime. This is a map put together by Carlos Mullenbach at the University of Alberta, a brilliant guy. He fingerprints where methane comes from. And so here's his map of all the leaking wells. And again, you can look at all of the leaking wells in the area that was shallowly fracked for coal. And then people are wondering, why have you got some methane and other hydrocarbons in people's water? No secret. Comes back to this piece of gum again, and and the quality of cement jobs along wellbores. And here we've got Maurice Dussault just talking about that very problem. So let me end with one last story. So I thought, okay, so I've gone to the States and I've looked at what's happened there, come to Rosebud and looked at what happened here with Jessica and her long fight to get the authorities to be accountable. And I thought, okay, well, what happened in Australia when they did the same thing? Right? Got a massive amount of coal seams, many of them very shallow, many of them actually filled with water. My goodness, what possibly could go wrong? This gal, her name is Simone Marsh, was an environmental consultant hired by the government to assess $30 billion worth of development plans for the drilling of coal seams in Queensland. And she said there's a problem with this application. It says nothing about groundwater and what the impacts will be on groundwater. Her superiors said, sorry, Simone, we need the application done and approved by next week. She said, well, that's wrong. And so she blew the whistle on the fact that there was never any proper water assessment of the impacts of this industry. And sure enough, I mean, they have huge methane bubbles coming up out of the Condamine River. You have ranchers and farmers throughout Queensland who can document all kinds of methane migrations into their water supply and elsewhere. One of the largest rural protest movements ever in the history of Australia is called Lock the Gate. Again, it's not an environmental movement. This is a movement of agricultural people protecting their agricultural base and their water supply. That's the kind of fragmentation that took place in Australia. And here's a great illustration of what happened when they started fracking the coals. A group of scientists from Southern Cross University went out. They said, okay, what's happening in these fracked fields? And these guys are oceanographers, actually. They took some equipment with them to measure the gases in the fields. And they found radon, methane, and CO2 at 3 times the levels in the frack fields than in fields, in areas, in basins that weren't being fracked. So the fracking was acting like a man-made earthquake that was releasing gases into the atmosphere at extraordinary levels. And there's just a great illustration of how these pathways were made and created by the use of this technology in these highly fractured coal seams in Australia. It's probably one of the most contentious issues ever in that country. All right, so that brings me to the end. I just want to say a few things about Jessica Ernst's legal case and then invite her to come up and talk about what it's like to be part of an 8-year-long lawsuit. Now, what makes this really unusual is that in most cases, there is no lawsuit. All right? So, company comes in, they frack into an aquifer, the landowner goes to the company, there's some kind of battle that goes on for a while, then the company says, you know what, we can't be bothered with this, here's a check, sign the confidentiality agreement, and goodbye. And that's normally what happens. And as a result, the cycle of abuse can carry on. Hundreds of these agreements have been signed in Alberta, and thousands of these agreements have been signed throughout the United States. The Catholic Church used exactly the same approach when they had pedophile priests on the loose in various parishes in Boston. It was the Boston Globe that tracked down how the Catholic Church covered up the gross and abusive behavior of these men, and they found the legal firm that drafted the confidentiality agreements that essentially locked the evidence from public view. And that unfortunately is exactly what has happened with the impacts of fracking. So Jessica said, okay, I'm not going to be part of that process. I will not settle. My case will go where it goes until all the evidence is on the table. And I've never followed a legal case that has gone on 8 years. I can tell you my faith in the Canadian legal system is, holy smokes, how can something like this go on for 8 years? There have been other similar cases in the United States that have went on for 3 years or 4 years, but not 8 years. And there are 3 important parts to her lawsuit. So one, she sued the Alberta government, Alberta Environment, she sued the regulator, and she sued Encana. Right? So Encana never objected to any part of the lawsuit, basically. Said, okay, you want to sue us, that's fine, let's go to court. Alberta Environment said, the regulator said, no, you can't sue us because we have an immunity clause that puts us above the law and says, you can't sue us for stuff that we do. And so then that case went to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal agreed. They said, the regulator's got immunity on this, but, and that's that. But the other parts of her case they say, no, that can proceed and go ahead. You can sue Encana and you can sue Alberta Environment. Well, after the regulator got immunity, then Alberta Environment said, well, we'll try that trick too. We probably got an immunity clause in our legislation somewhere, and you can't sue us. And so they tried it, and the judge said, no way, your legislation is totally different, and you know what, boys, you can be sued. And this case is proceeding against you. And so in the meantime, though, Jessica said, okay, it's not right not to have the regulator part of this lawsuit. They're the most guilty party. I mean, they're the bishop in Boston that covered up for everybody else. So that has now come to the Supreme Court. So I'd like to invite Jessica Ernst to come and speak about that experience. I know she doesn't really want to do this, but
I never thought of that one. The AER like the bishop in Boston. Ooh, I'm going to have fun with that one. Well, what a great talk, Andrew. That was incredible. Yes, I don't want to be up here. It's really hard. It's really hard in your own community, right? It's always hardest in our own community. What is it like to be in this lawsuit? I don't want to be in it either. Not only did I move to Rosebud for the quiet, but I moved here to escape humanity, like a lot of people do when they come here. I did not want to be in rooms of people like this. It's no offense to you. I have this incredible, very private place over there. Some of you have experienced my fangs come out when you come too close. That's because I need this massive, massive space. Rosebud has the most extraordinary space around it of anywhere in the world I have been. And in comes these law violators and destroyed my life. Because as working in the industry, and as I'm an all-patch consultant, but I'm also a scientist. So I have to know what happened. Then when I know what happened, I have to have all the data, not just a little bit of data, but all of it. And a massive amount of the data that I'm still waiting for, even with the lawsuit, I can't get. So when I began finding out what had happened, I realized I had to leave my life behind and give it up and do this lawsuit that I don't want to do. It's terrifying. It's destroying my body. The stress is so awful. Every day there's so many phone calls, emails. The stress is working with lawyers, watching every penny that you own vanish. What are you going to sell next? Then all the tricks by the defendants, they have everything. They have all the power, they have all the banks, they have you, but maybe not you anymore, right? That's the amazing thing that's keeping me going, is I'm seeing, like in Australia, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Texas, Denton, Texas, said no, big time. And the lawsuit is, it's become world known. Rosebud's become world known. And I think probably my biggest asset, so they've got all this power. I'm kind of scattered, but never mind. A CBC reporter asked me when we went public with the case in 2011, he said, he was very stressed and said, oh yeah, but you can't do this. Like, look at you, you're all alone. Like, you're just that, nothing, right? We're nothing. We think we're nothing. And the industry, our government, our regulators, the people that want us to do nothing but consume, they have trained us to think that we're nothing. And I said, yeah, well, yes. He said, they have all the money, they have all the banks, they have all the power, they have the courts, they have everything. I said, no, they don't have everything. They don't have heart. Because they don't exist. We are real. And we have imagination, and we have heart. And in this community, there's an incredible amount of imagination. And some of that imagination is very painful for some of the students I see come through here that break my heart, and how they heal and struggle, and the teachers and the management. And so to me, this lawsuit is about healing, finding out who I am, which terrifies me. We don't want to know who we really are when we're here, right? Just get me home. I just want to get to heaven fast. And probably my best asset, my imagination, my heart, but I also am a Taurus. I'm stubborn. And I won't step down. And the lawsuit has brought me home and taught me how incredibly powerful we are with our little nothing. Like, you are all no different than me. We're all the same. And when we set our mind to something, we can do anything. And when we don't stand down. No. Everybody, I've had so many people bully me, try to tell me I have to drop this lawsuit, I have to give it up, I have to gag, I have to settle, I have to do this, I have to do that. And I used to fight back. Now I just kind of smile, because I go, oh, they don't know me very well, do they? So I have come home, I have found who I am. The lawsuit's part of that. The book has been one of the hardest, most grueling things I've ever been a part of. Andrew is relentless. I've told him a few times, I can't believe we're still talking. Well, because he was phoning all day long. Oh, just one question, and an hour later, oh, just one, do you have that document? What about that document? Oh, what, did you read this? Yes, I read this. It's really hard, but there's more and more cases, and the greatest, most fantastic thing that has happened so far in my case is this event. So Shauna Murphy, it's her idea. And I think it says an incredible amount for the power of this community that you're all here. And the people from this community, do you know how many communities there are here tonight? Lethbridge, Fox Creek of the earthquakes. Hand up. Yeah, all the way from the earthquakes. They have sour gas up there. What if those earthquakes let go all that sour gas? We have Drumheller, we have Rockeford, we have Cochrane, we have Lyelta, we have Nameka, Red Deer, Ponoka, Didsbury. Oh, how could I forget Dagan and his sister? And yeah, and aunt and mom. Pardon? Catherine. Yeah, have I missed any? Strathmore. How could I forget Strathmore? Anyways, I've talked long enough, but my lawsuit is your lawsuit. I would never do this case for me or One Water Well. Never. The Canadian legal system is far too horrific. Thank you. Andrew, thank you.